Hi, Jai Bhim. This is Subodh from the School of Buddhist Studies by Digital Nalanda. We bring to you a unique session which is based on discussion, very short discussions on very important topics concerned with Buddhism. Today, our topic is Paticca Samuppada. This topic is finds very much important and very much it's a base of what we call the, uh, the the whole doctrine of Buddhism, and many interpretations are there. There people see it differently, and first we need to understand this topic in its original sense and how it has been interpreted from time and again. This short session being a part of our course Introduction to Basics in Buddhism, it will cover all the important topics in the form of short discussions, and there will be another course which has a detailed discussions on it. So it will be an advanced course. So we'll begin with today's session. We have with us Professor Bodhi with us, who is the mentor of School of Buddhist Studies. Welcome, sir. And I'll begin with the topic straight away, sir. What is Paticca Samuppada?
So thank you, Subodh. I think it's to go straight into the reflection. It is important that we should know that the teachings of the Buddha, or teachings of Shakyamuni, is very much to do with this idea of pain, lamentation, grief, unsatisfactoriness, suffering, distress. The Paticca Samuppada is a framework that Shakyamuni gave to us in order to help us understand why there is so much pain, there was distress, there's lamentation, grief, sorrow, suffering, and so on and so forth. But before we begin to think and attempt to understand the Paticca Samuppada, it is first important to know one particular framework that Shakyamuni taught us. In Pali, it is called the Iddapakayata, and generally it is translated as this/that conditionality. Some people call it the causal principle in Buddhism. It simply reads like this. Shakyamuni told us, to understand this world, first understand that what has arisen is simply because of the necessary conditions. When this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. This forms the basic framework of what is generally understood as a condition that gives rise to something else. There's nothing from a Buddhist perspective in which things exist in themselves. Everything only arises because of the necessary conditions that exist. Shakyamuni told us that there are 12 processes or links that arises depending on certain necessary conditions. Now, within the followers of Baba Sahib, or global Buddhism, if you were to look at how many of the Buddhists who practice and follow the path of Shakyamuni across the world speak about this particular framework, there are 12 links, and each of these links, as I said, are dependent. The first is generally understood as avijja. Second is understood as sankara, vijnana, namarupa, salayatana, phassa, vedana, tanha, upadhana, bhava, jati, jara, marana. Now, what does it mean? These are 12 concepts, each dependent on a particular condition for it to arise. This word avijja is generally translated as referring to ignorance. Ignorance of what? Ignorance of the condition of human life. What is that condition of human life that we experience? Shakyamuni told us there is a particular condition which we all experience. It's called lamentation, grief, sorrow, fear, pain, distress. And because of this, we suffer. Not that everybody will suffer at the same intensity, but all of us have to live this world of suffering. Generally, suffering is understood as a reaction to a particular feeling that you have in your body. If you are sad, the reaction to that state of sadness is what is generally called suffering. So there is this one realm, the Buddha says, that all human beings have to experience. And avidya is an ignorance of these processes of suffering. So the interpretation generally given about avidya is the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. That the world experiences level of suffering. There is a cause for suffering. The suffering can secede, and the way to cessation is generally called the noble, fruitful path. So avidya as this ignorance gives rise to what is generally called fabrications or reactions that people have. Because you don't know, you react. Okay, you don't know the necessary condition. So without the capacity for knowing the necessary condition, you begin to react. It is this kind of a reaction generally that is translated as sankhara. Sankhara is explained as a reaction, as a fabrication, sometimes as a volition that gives rise to something else. With sankhara as a necessary condition arises what is generally understood as vijnana or consciousness. There is a level of consciousness that is embedded in this body. With vijnana as a necessary condition, name and form, nama rupa. This is exactly what arises. With name and form or nama rupa as the necessary condition, we begin to have what is generally called the sixth sense door. The five senses plus the thinking capacity of the brain, these are generally called the sixth sense door. These sixth sense door come into contact with the external reality. Our eyes look into the external world. Our ears hear into the external world. Our nose smell the external reality. It is rare that the nose can smell what is happening inside my body, or the ear can hear what is inside my body, or the eyes can see what is inside me. The eyes is only tuned to the external world. The ear is tuned to the external world. And the minute contact takes place, immediately, Shakyamuni says, arises what is called Vedana or sensation. And these sensations at this particular level are experienced as pleasant sensation, unpleasant sensation, and neutral sensation. With this sensation called Vedana arises Tanha. And generally this is explained as a craving for the pleasant sensation, an aversion for the unpleasant sensation, and a neutral feeling for neutral sensation. So here you begin to experience the principle, in which there is craving for pleasant. So when you are, for instance, when you are very happy, what does happiness mean? If you go deep into happiness, you will find that your body is feeling very nice. There's a pleasant sensation in the body. You feel very pleasant and nice, and gives you happiness. It makes you smile, it makes you feel good about yourself. At times, we experience unpleasant sensation. Even if you tell your mind, even if you tell your thinking process, no, I am happy, the body is not allowing you to experience happiness. You will feel distress, you will feel grief, you will feel tired, you will feel unpleasant sensations in your body. So many people generally are not aware that all of this happiness, sadness, sorrow, pain is basically at the roots of it is the sensation. So this notion of the craving of and the aversion of the unpleasant is what is generally called tanha. With this particular tanha arises what is generally called clinging. We start clinging to that which we like or which is pleasant. You love the feeling, Sometimes people, they like a certain kind of food, they like a certain kind of spices. Some people, they like to drink, for instance, certain soft drinks, for instance. They love it. And each of those soft drinks especially, when you drink them, you feel very nice in your body. And the minute you feel that nice, you like to cling to that feeling, you see. So here, from tanha as necessary condition arises upadhana or clinging. And it is this clinging, Shakyamuni told us, and the way it is understood and interpreted, arises what is called existence or the becoming. process. Here, people then the process of becoming takes place. So this is generally called bhava. Now, with bhava as a necessary condition arises what is called jati, jara, marana. Jati as referring to birth, and jara, marana as aging and death. And when you reach jati, jara, marana, in which all human beings experience, all of us we are born, and all of us will have to age, and all of us will have to die. It is this which is the foundation of the experiences of pain, lamentation, grief, sorrow, distress, and so on and so forth. So the Paticca Samuppada, in the way it is basically spoken about, talked about globally, this is the kind of framework that generally people use to interpret the 12 links of what is called the dependent origination. Many people give it other names, but dependent origination means a particular state that originates only because of it is dependent on another necessary condition. That's what the Paticca Samuppada generally refers to. So this is generally a brief about how people generally understood the Paticca Samuppada.
Sir, the theory of dependent origination, it's very important, very much at the root of Buddhism. But considering so many interventions that have happened through periods, is there any other way we look to look at Paticca Samuppada or this of dependent origination?
There is, if you listen to many of the practitioners of the Buddha Dhamma in India, who basically follows Baba Sahib Ambedkar, then many of them, not all of them, but many of them tend to look at Paticca Samuppada not in the way it is understood, in the way I've explained to you just now. That's the normal way in which many Buddhists across the world understand. Paticca Samuppada as the fundamental theoretical basis that Shakyamuni taught us how to understand this notion of suffering. You see? So this first framework generally relies on what is understood as the dukkha perspective of Paticca Samuppada, the dukkha perspective, the suffering perspective. Okay, and this is so because Shakyamuni himself spoke it in this particular manner. He spoke about the Four Noble Truths, the Ida Pakayata, and the Paticca Samuppada as one combined when he was speaking to many of the people during his time. The other way of understanding the Paticca Samuppada, if you listen to what people are discussing in India, for instance, is the anatta perspective of the Paticca Samuppada, not the dukkha perspective. There is another perspective called the anatta perspective. Okay. Now, the anatta perspective has a very different take. It is very similar, but it has a very different take. In the anatta perspective, avidya is not ignorance. Avijna is actually a state of no mind. And generally people translate it as insentience. Okay, there is no mind. So by avidya, you're referring to a state of no mind, no mental activity that takes place. And with this as a necessary condition, sankhara is what you understand called the rise of sensation, or what is also understood as mental constructions of sensory entities that are beginning to arrive and rise as visualized. So with avidya, no mind, the insentience, sankhara is the rise of what you understand called the sentience or the sensations. Now with sankhara as explained as sensation, vijnana is perception. Okay, vijnana is not consciousness per se, but it is a form of consciousness, and that consciousness is the perception that begins to arise from a state of sensation. Nama rupa is image and name. Salayatana, nama rupa as the necessary condition. Salayatana is cognition. Okay, cognition. Now this is very important because salayatana, when we say cognition, is that each of these six sense door, they begin to cognize. We have these sense door, salayatana, which has the capacity for cognition, and phassa, which arises from salayatana, is what is generally translated as cognize, to recognize. This is the first level of cognize a particular area. You have ear cognition, you have eye cognize, you have touch cognize, you have smell cognize, you have taste cognize, and you even have the concept cognize. The mind, the thinking brain begins to cognize. So this is translated as phassa. Now, with phassa as a necessary condition arises what you call vedana, feelings that are pleasant and unpleasant, okay, and also neutral feelings. With vedana as pleasant and unpleasant and neutral feeling arises an emotional reaction to these pleasant or unpleasant feelings, which is generally called tanha. Tanha is not craving. It is craving in some way, but the deeper understanding of tanha is an emotional reaction to your state of pleasant and unpleasant sensational feeling. With tanha as the base, we begin to arise what is called upadhana. What is upadhana? When you begin to personalize this emotional reaction. This is me. I am the one who's experiencing these emotions. These emotions are mine. You begin to identify with these. You personalize this. So what I feel as pleasant and unpleasant, and what is it, my emotional reaction to these, you cannot experience it. Others cannot experience it. I cannot experience your emotional reactions to your state of pleasant and unpleasant feeling. So because you cannot and only I can, I begin to personalize. And this personalization is explained as upadhana. With personalization as the necessary condition arises bhava. With this personalization arises the personality of the being. Now this personality is a construct. It is not real. And it is this personality which is merely a construct that does not exist in itself. It's just a construct. That is what is generally understood as the not self, anatta. There is no self there. There is no self. This thing that you call the I is just a mere personality. It's a construct. It doesn't have an existence by and in itself. It is not substantive. So with this I now comes into being. Now this I, you see, bhava, this I that comes into being, which is just merely a construct. This I is wanting to understand, who does this I identify itself with? Generally, if you go into the deeper thinking process, this I is identified with the body. Okay, because what else will we identify the I with? I can't identify the I with some other material reality outside of me. The I is me, and who is this me? The body. And what does this body experience? It experiences what is generally called the past, the present, and the future. The past is your birth, jati. The present is what is called jara, the aging. And the future is death, marana. And it's from this particular perspective arises this whole gamut and realms of pain, of sorrow, of lamentation, of grief, of distress, and the suffering that we have. As I said again, not all human beings experience the same intensity of suffering. But the Buddha was more concerned with how do we respond to suffering. And in this response to suffering, this particular framework of jati, jara, marana, or this framework of the Paticca Samuppada, is a way to explain from an anatta perspective. If you go deep, you will find that you don't even exist. But you exist only because the most necessary condition called avijja, the state of no mind, is the basis of which arises this whole idea of what you call mental constructions and of sensory entities in the sense of sensation. So there is a realm of avijja called insentience, and the sentient being or the sensation begins to arise and creates layers and layers that becomes the basis for the arising of some another layer till we experience what we call suffering. So the other perspective that is generally spoken among many followers of the Buddha, especially those within the followers of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, they begin to also speak about the Paticca Samuppada not merely from a dukkha perspective. Okay, they speak it from an anatta perspective. Okay, because there is something unique about the Indian context. See, the whole world has experienced the Buddhism that moved out of this country. But the Buddhism that experiences India is contextual. It is born out of this experience. It is born. So here, the interpretation is not a single interpretation. There are multiple interpretations of Paticca Samuppada, and another interpretation of which is the Anatta perspective to the Paticca Samuppada. So that's how generally you will hear people discussing and debating about the Paticca Samuppada. So if you want to understand suffering, who is this that who suffers? So anatta becomes very fundamental. If you don't realize that there is really no self, who is this self that is suffering then? So this is the debate which people kind of speak about, talk about from this perspective. Yeah.
And, so you also said that this is very much contextual and very much because this geographical location that is bounded like around, like we are in this geographical location, but when this Buddhism goes outside and when it becomes a kind of ideology which others also are looking up to. And also he talked about the Ambedkarite perspective and the Navyana tradition that you follow. There could be another way to interpret Paticca Samuppada. There could be another perspective to see Paticca Samuppada.
Yeah. Another perspective in the sense?
In the sense, because you talked about the Indian context and you talked about because this Buddhism like born out of this Indian reality or this reality, but as you see that what all suffering or what all things are going universally, what all things are going around the world. So there could be another perspective to see this kind of theory or doctrine.
So you're asking me if there's another perspective to understand the Paticca Samuppada?
Yes.
There is actually, but this is not spoken too much. This is spoken mainly among practitioners, people who practice Buddhism, who have gone deep into the jhanas. They speak a very different language, especially the followers of Babasaheb Ambedkar and those who take their Buddhist practice very seriously. It is not that they negate the dukkha perspective, they accept the dukkha perspective, because that is the most prevalent way of looking at the Paticca Samuppada. And they are open to the anatta perspective, because the Paticca Samuppada is also a theory that helps us understand there's no self. But there is another perspective, and this is generally spoken among practitioners, and we must be very careful when we speak about this. Now, as you pointed out, the context, the Indian context is a very complex context. Here, it is not individual suffering, it is social suffering. The world has not understood the social suffering that people experiences in this reality, you see. So, the third perspective, which you will hear only the practitioners generally speak, which is not very prevalent, very normative, very prevalent among, as a discourse within many people who follow Buddhism, is generally what is called the Aniksha perspective. The Aniksha perspective of the Paticca Samuppada. Now, what is the Aniksha perspective? The Aniksha perspective, you will have to bring a whole teachings of Shakyamuni to be able to understand the Aniksha perspective. You will have to bring the jhanas, you will have to bring the khandas, you will have to bring the paramitas, you will have to bring the this, that conditionality, you will have to bring a whole lot of theoretical framework, kamma, and so on and so forth, to begin to understand the Aniksha perspective. And to me, at a very personal level, the Aniksha perspective is the deepest possible way of trying to understand the Paticca Samuppada. In this perspective, Paticca Samuppada is not merely a theoretical framework, the most deepest possible theoretical framework to understand dukkha. It is not even a framework that helps you understand anatta. The Paticca Samuppada is a universal law. It's the law of being inception. Many religions in this world, they have their own ways of interpreting how this world came to be. Forget about the world, how the universe came to be. There are some people who believe that this world was created, this universe was created by a God. Some people say there was a first unmoving principle that gave rise to this moving matter in motion kind of a reality. There are some people who say, no, there is something called an intelligent design, or what is called the great design. That this world is, my goodness, the intelligence in this design is tremendous. Who is this intelligent thing that we get that created this world? So the normal way of understanding the origin of the universe is to speak at it from a creator perspective, but is generally also argued as the ontological perspective. The first principle perspective, which is also linked with Aristotle and the whole debate of what we understand called the first cause, the first principle. This is generally called the cosmological perspective, if I'm not mistaken. And the third one is called the great design argument. See, the intelligent design argument. Now, these are the three very dominant ways to explain how this whole world originated. But with the coming of science, so science has given another origin story of the universe and refers to what is called the Big Bang. The Big Bang theory of science is how this world came to be. Now, we have four major schools in the world that predominates how the origin of the universe. You may ask now, what is the Buddhist origin story of the universe? How do Buddhists understand this idea of how things came to be? For the Buddhists, there is no heaven, there is no hell. There is no God, there is no devil. This world is not governed by a God and a devil, and a heaven and a hell. This world is governed by a law, and that law is called the Paticca Samuppada. And that is why we say dependent origination. This is the Buddhist concept of origination, how things originated in this universe. Now, I will not use the word universe, I'll use it in quote, because Buddhists don't think that there is a universe. Buddhists talk about a multiverse. There are too many dimensions that the Buddha spoke about for us to reduce it to a universe. Now, from this perspective, you see, if this is how Buddhists, especially here in India, we begin to, some of us who are thinking about these processes, when you listen to many of the practitioners of the Buddhist practitioners in India, you will hear this kind of thing. And this is spoken only among people who have gone deep into what is generally called the Satipatthana. Okay, people who have gone deep into the practice of cultivation, of introspection, of meditation, and so on and so forth. Here they explain it differently. For them, avidya is neither ignorance nor a state of no mind. Avidya is generally referred to what we understand called a state of the unborn, the unarisen, the unmanifested. See, if you go to one particular sutta called the Upadhana Sutta, the Buddha made a very interesting point. He says, verily, there is the unborn, the unarisen, the unmanifested. And because of the unborn, of the unarisen and the unmanifested, that is the condition that gives rise to the born, the manifested, and so on and so forth. So here, avidya is referred to as a state of non-knowing. It is not a state of no mind or ignorance, but a state of non-knowing, avidya, a state of non-knowing. And what is that state of knowing, non-knowing? A state of the unborn, the unarisen, the unmanifested. It is this that the fundamental basis. Now, very interestingly, when the Buddha speaks about this, the Buddha speaks about this as a dense energy, as a moving reality. It is not, I'm using the word anicca, impermanence. In the Buddhist framework, nothing is static. Everything is a state of movement. How do you explain it from a movement perspective? That you have to experience it. It is not something that can be theorized. Because that particular reality, which is the unborn, you cannot use words to explain that reality. this unborn, unarisen, unmanifested, is too small a capability to even begin to comprehend that. You have to go there and experience it yourself. The Buddha in the jhanas explained this as the state of neither perception nor non-perception. Perception doesn't exist there, and neither non-perception exists there. You know? He also speaks of the state of nothingness. And nothingness in Buddhism is very different. No-thingness. You know, not nothing, but no-thingness. It's not that something is not there. It is there, but it is no thing. From this non-knowing, avidya, arises sankhara. Now, sankhara is spoken in Buddhism from an Aniksha perspective as referring to one particular line by the Buddha. All compound things, okay, all compound things pass through the inconceivably rapid movement of three things: upada, arising; tithi, peaking; and bhanga, ceasing. All things, as referred to sankhara, is this sudden rise, peaking, and ceasing. This particular process is fundamental to the way many people begin to understand the notion of sankhara. What is sankhara? Some element that rises, peaks, and passes away so fast that you cannot measure it. You just have to experience it. There is no way you can even begin to talk about it. Okay? So why sankhara? We are referring to these compound things that are constantly rising, peaking, and passing away, rising, peaking, and passing away. With this as a necessary condition arises what is generally called vijnana. Now, vijnana, in this perspective of Aniksha, generally refers to what is called the sensory consciousness. It is not consciousness the way we have. I'm conscious about you and you're conscious about me at this point in time. But sensory consciousness. The senses, each of these elements that are generally embedded in this rising, peaking, and passing away, each of these elements they have a characteristic. Okay. Now, this is not available in the Pali Suttas, but is available in the suttas of those people, especially in Myanmar. And what do they talk about? They use one word called kalapa. Kalapa in Buddhism is the smallest particle with certain kind of characteristics. Kalapa. So when we are referring to this word called vijnana, in the Aniksha perspective, we are referring to this smallest possible particle with characteristics, but sensory, having capacity to be itself, having some, we call it characteristics in that particular sense. So when we are talking about vijnana, we are not referring to consciousness, or we are not referring to what you understand called perception. We are referring to small particles, kalapa, which is generally spoken among the Myanmaris. Okay. Kalapa, with this ability to have its own behavior. It has its own behavior. So that's how it is spoken about. Now, with vijnana as a necessary condition, nama-rupa arises. These kalapas manifest into form and substance. So form and substance in nama-rupa is understood as, if you look at the world, everything is form. It has a size, it has a shape, it has a length, there is a breadth, there is form. And in that form, there is substance. You look at a tree, there is a form and there is substance, matter that fills that form. You look at a hill, you look at the universe, you look at the planets, you look at the galaxies, everything is having a form. This is what is generally understood as nama-rupa. So form and substance. With form and substance as a necessary condition, it gives rise to what we call salayatana. It gives rise to the sixth sense door across, let's say, including humans, including animals, including the smallest possible animals, even probably in plants. Okay, you begin to have what you understand called the sixth sense door. It doesn't manifest in all beings that exist in the same manner, but it begins to manifest itself as a sixth sense door, which is the five senses plus the thinking brain, which is generally called the mano. Now, if you go deep into mano, among the practitioners, they will speak about another word called chitta, but I will not speak about it this right now because it's a bit complex. It's an emotional part of the brain, the emotional aspects of the brain. Now, in this context, what is very important to understand is this, that with Salayatana, this sixth sense door, comes phassa. Okay, phassa also is understood as contact, also understood as cognize. Okay, you begin to cognize and you begin to get in touch with many other things that exist in the world. The minute phassa takes place, again Vedana arises. Sensations of the pleasant and the unpleasant and the neutral sensations begin to arise. Now you're talking. Now it's very important to understand Vedana, because in Buddhism, Vedana is the place where we all have to go to when we enter the highest stage of the jhanas. Okay, we begin to observe what you call the pleasant sensation, the unpleasant sensation, because it is from here that arises what is generally understood as the craving and the aversion, or what is understood as the binary principle of life, or what is understood as the dialectics of nature. You know, here you begin to experience the dialectics, the craving and the aversion that takes place. This is generally called Vedana. And that craving and aversion is what is understood. So from this pleasant and unpleasant sensation arises tanha, the craving and the aversion that takes place. Okay. So with tanha as a necessary condition, then arises upadhana. And upadhana is also understood as what is understood called the personalization of craving, not clinging per se, but personalization. And from this personalization, bhava, the personality arises, the I arises. Even in the Aniksha perspective, okay, it takes into consideration the anatta, the non-self that exists in this I that you and me generally identify with. Because in the Buddhist perspective, this I is nothing but a construct of personality. Anybody who comes from psychology can make a very distinct difference between personality and temperament. Temperament is that which is in you. Personality is a conditioning. It is conditioned by society. You are conditioned into a personality. That's why people say personality training, which means I can change your personality if I wish to. You see? So bhava is personality. And again, with this rise of this I doesn't have an independent existence. It's just merely a binary construct created from craving and aversion. You know? So the I can never know itself. The I doesn't know itself. Because it doesn't know itself, it needs what you understand called, and it uses generally language, you know, the tall and the short, the long and the long and the not so long, for instance, the black and the white, you know, the big and the small. So it uses this binary principle to begin to comprehend this world. And in doing that, because it doesn't know itself, it generally identifies itself with the body. And with the body, as I said, when it identifies, it looks at the past, present, and future. And the past is jati, birth, jara marana, aging and death. And here arises the realm Buddha calls dukkha. We generally, among the many followers of Baba Sahib and the Buddha in India, dukkha, dukh, sadness, kha, a state of sadness. It is a state of sadness. We are not referring to it as, you know, many people like to eulogize and even talk about suffering in that manner. You know? But he says there is a state of sadness that we all have to experience. And only the insights of each of these will give you a sense of what this so-called state of sadness is all about. In the Aniksha perspective, the state of sadness is seen much more as a manifest of the binary reality that is lived with the I that doesn't know itself. It's a binary experience as a binary reality. Happy and sad, you know, lamentation, grief and joy, you know, sorrow and happiness. You experience this kind of a reality, you see. So here it is understood very differently. The argument is generally something like this, that when you realize that this lamentation, grief, this realms of dukkha is a binary, is an experience of a binary reality. It's in the dissolution of the binary, which is generally called the jhanas. You do it through the jhanas. What is the jhanas? Is a very disciplined practice to dissolve the binary and to experience the unity. You know? So when you dissolve the binary and experience the unity, there you begin to experience what is generally called this whole range from Jati Marana till you reach Aniksha. And when you reach Aniksha, for instance, then we speak about something in Buddhism called the freedom of mind. So these are the ways in which you begin to understand the Paticca Samuppada from the perspectives of Anicca. So this is another way of looking at it. It is not spoken, among many practitioners, but only the serious ones who have gone into what is generally called the Arupa Jhanas. The Arupa Jhanas, when you begin to experience, the boundless space, boundless consciousness, when you begin to experience nothingness, and when you begin to experience the highest jhana called the neither perception nor non-perception. When you begin to experience this, the Paticca Samuppada is not merely the law that explains suffering or the law that experiences this construct, this non-existent imaginary I called anatta, but it also explains, it is a universal law that explains the universe itself. The Buddha says something very beautiful. He says that the one who has seen the Paticca Samuppada has seen the Dhamma. And the one who knows the Dhamma always knows the Paticca Samuppada. The one who knows the Paticca Samuppada has understood the noble truths of suffering. Because the noble truth of suffering only arises as an insight after you have understood the Paticca Samuppada. So this is another way of looking. It is not prevalent, and only the followers of Baba Sahib generally speak in this language, because we are very concerned. In India, we are very concerned not to only reduce Buddhism to merely a theory of suffering. For us, Buddhism is, we accept that there is suffering, but Buddhism is a theory of happiness, a theory of nibbana, a theory of freedom of mind, a theory of truth that explains how we can free our mind. So for us, Buddhism is a theory of happiness. It is not a theory of sadness. It's not a theory of suffering. We do not negate, but our thrust is in nibbana. That doesn't mean that we negate dukkha. It's just that the thrust of the followers of Shakyamuni in India at this point in time are people who are concerned how to free our mind and to attain happiness in this world. So this is the other interpretation of the Paticca Samuppada. It's very difficult to understand. You'll have to go deep into it, because I will tell you only this much. If you have not experienced the Arupa Jhanas, you will not be able to comprehend the Paticca Samuppada from this perspective. So in short, you see, there's the dukkha perspective of the Paticca Samuppada. There's the anatta perspective of the Paticca Samuppada. And there's the Anicca perspective. And what is the most beautiful thing about the Anicca perspective? Just for the sake of discussion, everything is in a state of impermanence and movement. Nothing from a Buddhist perspective is ever static. Even the unborn, the unarisen, is in a state of movement. So this is how generally we kind of understood it.
It is in very short span, you have covered this three very important interpretation of Paticca Samuppada. And I'm sure our students have a lot of questions for you. We'll be discussing this topic in detail in our advanced course, and also you can put your questions in the community section of our website. But for now, we are closing this session. So thank you, Bodhisa.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So much. Till we meet again for the next topic.
Okay, thank you. Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim.